So we'll slowly start. Samprati is talking to us from Delhi, where it is now past 11:30 at night. So we'll make it strong and colorful tonight. Samprati is a very vehement walker and writer and an anthropologist. She lives now for more than 2 decades in New Delhi and knows the city as her pocket, like we say in Dutch. And she is also a postdoctoral researcher at the Max Weber Forum for South Asian Studies in New Delhi. And she is working now on a project on repair and maintenance practices in urban marketplaces of India. She is as well the editor of a blog. As a writer, is she exploring forms of writing the city? So I'll let you say the blog once more. It is chiragdilly.com, which you find as well on the Walkers and Create description of this event tonight. So if you want to read more from Samprati after this talk, you find it there. And Samprati, very happy and thank you for being with us tonight. And let's listen to your walking story and then have a talk together.
Thank you so much for this invitation. About the conversation that we'll have after the talk and maybe continue the conversation beyond this event. So I'm going to be sharing some aspects and some parts of the journey of my walking practice. And I'm also going to be sharing some insights from my walking ethnography. Now, some of these reflections might appear as very fundamental or commonsensical questions about walking, but I also feel that perhaps they tend to be taken for granted. And then there are some reflections which are very rooted in the specificities of the city of Delhi, which is where I live and walk. I may not be able to convey all the complexities of these specificities, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So I'm going to just start right away. What I was just saying about specificities, it actually brings me to the first question that I have about walking. Now, walking is considered to be an elementary form of knowing, experiencing, and traversing any place, and cities are what I'm interested in. There's nothing natural or universal about it. It's rooted in the specificities of bodies and places, among other factors. So who is walking matters. Class, gender, age, do you have a fit body, often has a bearing on walking. For instance, a street vendor, what you see here, a street vendor walking with a push cart has a very different body technique and has different challenges of traversing the unevenness of the street than by, say, somebody who is walking in a neighborhood park. Now, related to this question of who is walking, there's also the question of where is one walking? Because any place, including cities, do not have a neutral terrain that just about anybody at any time can walk in any which way. And big cities like Delhi, on one hand, they provide freedom and mobility, but on the other hand, they're also increasingly marked by inequalities in access to public places, particularly for the poor and for women. So my work engages with what I refer to as walking as dwelling. That is, the ways in which walking is bound with how people live their everyday lives. How do they go about their routines of work, domesticity, and leisure? And walking is not just about going elsewhere, but it is also about how people come to inhabit places and make places. Now, my work in some ways makes a conscious move away from looking at walking as an event, as a novelty or experiment. And in doing so, I'm in no way privileging a particular form of walking, but rather I'm trying to draw attention to walking in its very everyday, ordinary, and taken for granted form, and trying to understand its nuances and what are the possibilities that it creates. So as I was thinking about what I'm going to talk about in this talk, and I was reflecting about my relationship with walking, it got me thinking about when did it actually begin. And it possibly started some more than 2 decades ago when I had just started college and I started traveling to places beyond the neighborhood in which I lived. It had only been 2 years since I'd arrived in Delhi, and I'd come from a small town in eastern India, and Delhi still seemed as a very strange and gigantic place. And I was both fascinated by the city and intimidated by the scale and diversity of the city. And curiously, my walking practice actually coincided with me starting to use public bus transport. And at that time, buses used to be overcrowded and they were particularly unsafe for women. So at some point, I started getting off the bus before my stop and I would walk a longer distance home. And I would keep varying the stops, and some days I would avoid the bus altogether and walk some 6, 7 kilometers to get somewhere. I would sometimes refer to a map, but there were times when I would just ask people on the street for directions, which meant that I often got lost, but it also made me discover new streets and new routes. So while walking, in some ways, like I started walking because I wanted to become familiar with a new city and also escape the bus. The effect this practice had was that it made a big city small for me. It made it possible for me to know some parts of the city more intimately, step by step, over repetitions, creating my own personal map of landmarks, shortcuts, spots to rest on the street, parts of the street to avoid. I only started consciously thinking of my walking practice when I began fieldwork for my doctoral research in 2016. And this phase of my practice, in some ways, has been about getting to know the familiar unknown. So my research is on weekly bazaars of Delhi, and these are makeshift periodic street markets that are held on a fixed day of the week across different neighborhoods. They're usually referred to by the name of the by the day of the week on which they are held. For instance, there are Monday bazaars and Tuesday bazaars and so on. These bazaars are the locus for the movement of an amazing diversity of commodities and services required for everyday life. And through these bazaars, a city space, a pavement, or lanes of a neighborhood, or even an open square in a neighborhood, which otherwise has more or less fixed uses on other days of the week, it gets transformed into this dense and bustling marketplace and a place of leisure and sociality. In these slides, this is one of the lanes in which the bazaar is getting set up. Here you can see traders uh, putting up their stalls, and this is when people start trickling into the bazaar, and when the bazaar is in full swing, it's a very crowded place. When I started field work, I was already somewhat familiar with these bazaars because even as I shifted houses over the years, I would always frequent the bazaar closest to my house. But then, being a city dweller, using these bazaars and being an anthropologist studying them is not the same thing. And the transition from one to the other was not a straightforward one for me. Like if it is disorienting for an anthropologist to arrive at a new place and get acquainted, it can be equally disorienting uh, to continue to be in a city which is home and then approach it as an anthropologist one fine day when fieldwork starts. So my initial field visits were quite dampening, and as I tried to approach some of the bazaar traders with the purpose of conducting interviews, they were very suspicious of my intentions and they would refuse to speak to me. I had prepared a list of questions, and I was not carrying with me, but they were continuously in my head, and that did not make conversations any easier. Um, and after several false starts, I realized that I needed to pay attention to the how of conducting field work. What I had done in these bazaars prior to my field work was walk, and it is what all customers in the bazaar do. And customers do not always plan their routes, and walking itself shapes the routes and itineraries. So what I decided to do as part of my field work was to walk without a planned itinerary, rather than approach specific people to start conversations around my research. I walked in bazaars in different neighborhoods and at different times of the day, and I did this repetitively. I walked by myself and I walked with others. I walked with friends, with customers, with fellow researchers, basically anyone willing to walk with me. One can argue that you never really walk alone in the bazaar because you are continuously surrounded by different kinds of people who are also walking. But then walking in the bazaar with someone else is a very different sort of a social experience. It becomes a mode of sensing, navigating, and inhabiting the bazaar collaboratively. So in one of these walks, the person walking with me advised me on the technique of walking in the bazaar, and he said that it was a very hot day and I had to spend long hours in the bazaar. And he said that this trick to not getting tired was to walk at a slow pace but keep at it. Now, this seemed like very commonsensical advice for walking long hours in the bazaar, which usually does not have a place where you can sit to rest. But then I realized that the advice applies as much to doing anthropological research. It is about slowing down. It is about not being in a hurry to get from here to there, not being in a hurry to figure things out. And more importantly, it is also about persevering and keeping at it, which I think is central to any kind of practice. So walking allowed me to engage in a process of learning by doing. It allowed me to make a shift from learning about the bazaar, which is what I was struggling with initially, to learning with the bazaar. And by this, I mean having a feeling for it or getting to know it intuitively. Now, with this background, I want to move to sharing some vignettes of my walking ethnography, which are from one particular bazaar. This is a neighborhood Delhi called Nizamuddin Basti, which has a Monday bazaar. This is a low-income neighborhood, and in my vignettes, I'm going to primarily focus on the relationship of women with the bazaar. The first vignette I'm going to share is a conversation I had with this woman, Saira. She's a middle-aged woman, and uh, she was talking about her life, and she was also talking about her walks in the bazaar. But she said this very interesting. She made this very interesting statement. She said, "It is said that when a person makes a way for herself, she has to walk that path too, and then the path keeps making itself." Now, this statement of Saira's is as much about how walking unfolds as about the struggles of her life. And she intersperses the story of her life, of her desire to be financially independent, with stories of her walks in the Monday Bazaar, where she spends a lot of time every week. She tells me of the long way she has come from the time she used to earn just rupees 500 a month at a beauty parlor without her husband's knowledge, making the journey to her workplace, crying throughout the walk because she found it humiliating that her husband did not allow her to work or give her money for her expenses. At the time that I met her, she was a community health worker, and she considered herself independent and confident, but also far from fulfilling all her desires. I have a long way to walk, she tells me, using a walking metaphor yet again as she shares her plans for her future. It's perhaps Saira's fascination for new experiences that connects her to the Monday Bazaar. Every Monday, there's a new shop, you get to see new faces, new people, she tells me. She likes walking through the bazaar slowly, meandering back and forth through every lane of the bazaar. I check out everything as I walk. I see everything, whether I have to buy something or not, she tells me. Like Saira, many women of the Basti have a ritual of going to the Monday Bazaar every week. They refer to this practice as Bazaar Karna, which literally means doing bazaar. Now, what makes possible the repetition of this ritual is the proximity of the bazaar. The bazaar spills into the alleys of the neighborhood, and it is right in the midst of people's houses. All you have to do is step out of your house and you're in the bazaar, is how a lot of women would explain to me why the bazaar was a popular haunt for them. A lot of women from the neighborhood explain the ritual of doing bazaar in very instrumental terms. The need to provision for home, to take advantage of good deals and save money, to avoid wasting money on traveling to some other market. And they would downplay aspects of what is known as ghumna. Ghumna means roaming or wandering, slightly more complex than that. They would tend to downplay the aspects of ghumna in the time that they spend in the bazaar. Yet there would be contradictions both in their walking narratives and in their walking practices, which would reveal the significance of ghumna. Noor Jahan, who's another bazaar regular, made it seem as if ghumna was incidental to her time spent in the bazaar. I don't go to the bazaar to roam, but I end up roaming. Since I'm anyway out shopping, I end up eating out with friends or relatives, and it's like a social excursion. But the manner in which women talk about the bazaars, their eyes lighting up, talking excitedly, cracking jokes, does not hold together the instrumentality of just shopping or providing for the home that women try to perform in their narratives. Even if shopping might be the reason that takes women to the bazaar, it is through their repetitive practices of doing bazaar that women have also forged affective ties with the bazaar. This affective atmosphere is something that you feel in the bazaar, in the casual intimacy of encounters in the course of walking. Ghumna, with its actually has multiple connotations. It can mean roaming, circulating, turning around, taking around, sauntering. And ghumna is inseparable from doing. It is a technique of navigating the bazaar, but it is also about getting to know the bazaar better. It is about having new experiences and renewing relationships with and in the bazaar. Places like weekly bazaars in Delhi become public places because of the walking practices of women that get folded into these bazaars. The women of Nizamuddin Basti create free time and find ways to uphold their ritual of going to the bazaar. And in doing so, they might be fulfilling certain gendered responsibilities, such as shopping for the family, but at the same time, they're asserting themselves and creating possibilities of freedom through their walking itineraries. The ritual of going to the bazaar also perhaps marks a break, even respite from the routines of every day. And there is, e- even though the ritual involves repetition, there is something new that introduces itself into the repetition. It's never identical. Not only do different women do different things in the bazaar, but also every visit in the bazaar has the possibility of the unexpected. You might bump into a friend you haven't seen in a while, you might discover new shops, new routes, new people. Difference is also built into the rhythms of walking in the bazaar. Walking rhythm unfolds over time. It involves slowing down, sometimes increasing your pace, pausing, overtaking, making stops, stepping aside to let someone pass by, making a dash between a gap in the crowd. This technique of an improvising rhythm is something that you learn in the bazaar through your repetitive walks. And part of this improvising rhythm is paying attention to the milieu of the bazaar. And by the milieu of the bazaar, I mean both the materiality of the bazaar, the densely packed shops, then there are uh, shops on the move like the push carts, and then there is the crowd. Um, you are continuously watching your steps so that you don't step on someone else's foot or onto a shop at ground level. You have to be continuously mindful of the street's uneven surface. Taking care while walking in the bazaar is also about trying to maintain a distance, however tiny, between yourself and other walkers. When the bazaar is being set up or is getting ready to open for business, like in this photograph, it is possible to walk in long strides with the arms swinging. But as the bazaar gets more and more crowded, the arms become restricted and the steps smaller. Walking in the bazaar is a continuously improvised body technique, not because an individual can walk in any which manner, but because your walking rhythm has to be continuously modulated in relation to other walkers. Many bazaar regulars would tell me that you don't walk in the bazaar walks you. You need to continuously improvise your rhythm so that you walk with the crowd as much as the crowd walks with you. Which brings me to the title of this talk, which is Don't Walk Your Tune, Walk Carefully. And this is something that a fellow walker in the bazaar had advised me. This is actually the key to walking in the bazaar. And this is also the reason why walking in the bazaar is a social activity, even if you're a solo walker. So the bazaar is constituted and enacted through the movements of its many walkers. Otherwise, then it would just be a collection of shops. Walking in the bazaar sets things into motion, tires, encounters, exchange, relationships. And it is through walking and walking repetitively that people make the street and the bazaar theirs. Most significantly, walking in the bazaar makes it possible for women and diverse other people to be outside in the street, maintaining its public character and vitality. And it is in this sense that walking as dwelling practices have the potential to be both creative and.
Thank you, Samprati. It was delightful to walk with you. Can you hear me? There was
Yeah, I can.
Good, good. Because, Anna, did you manage to solve your sound problem? Maybe not. If you cannot hear me, you cannot answer neither. But anyway, thank you so much, Samprati, for this tour of the bazaar, roaming and wandering, and following the paths of people that make their path in the bazaar. Now, if there are any feedback, comments, questions, feel free to speak. You can also use the chat, which is on the top right. There's a little icon chat, and you can write there also a question if you would prefer to write it down. And we can start to have a talk about walking in the bazaar. So, Bob, I suppose you want to ask a question yourself?
No, it just seemed that you were describing walking as an activity. I'm coming at it from a fine art point of view, as within the tradition of Western art, and it's really quite a radically different approach. So I see you seeing environment very much as a backdrop, whereas I see environment as a springboard to group consciousness. So one would have a descriptive reaction, i.e. you describe the various actions of people. But when you refer to affective activity, it seemed a way that you could bring more of what was vital in, as you say, you called it the unpredictable part of it, or the surprising part of it, which is the thing that would be of interest to me, because otherwise it's kind of boring in a way.
And I don't see the environment as background because then places would be just there and people would be coming and using it. I'm more interested in how people make those places, because places also don't remain the same, and don't remain the same not just over a longer period of time. The bazaar itself is different things at different points of time, and it's really the moving bodies which set things into motion. And there are ebbs and flows of the bazaar. So it's the various things that people do in the bazaar, and central to those doing various things is walking, which makes the bazaar a particular kind of place. So it's not like the environment is given and then people use it, but people are also shaping that environment.
What I'm asking isn't quite that question. You're doing it from a yourself-centered point of view, i.e. yourself looking at the bazaar, not necessarily as a backdrop, but as some sort of activity. I'm looking at it not from a self-oriented point of view, but from a group perspective. It's a bit of a walk into the unknown. The other one, you're giving names and labels to things and identifying them, whatever that is, but it's really from your own perspective, from an individual. So when Pollock developed literalism, it was he as an individual saying that everything is art, and what you're saying in walking, everything is experience. But there's
it is certainly not one kind of experience. People have different experiences, but there is also something less tangible, what I was referring to as the affect of the bazaar, and also the feelings that people associate with the bazaar, which somewhere is very closely tied to their ritual of walking in the bazaar.
Could you link that to a spiritual experience in any way? Because that would be of interest if you could bring it round.
Yeah, that is something.
We have in the chat the remark of Viv, who is interested in the idea of crowd walking, and you have a personal experience of that. Could you tell something about that, Viv?
Yeah, I was very interested in what you were saying about crowd walking, because it actually made sense of my experience in India, which I spent quite a lot of time in Bangalore a couple of times. And I must say, when I started, I felt very frustrated as a walker there. I didn't seem to be able to make any progress at all, and I definitely couldn't cross any roads. And it was the road that I was mainly trying to cross was in fact a bazaar road, but I hadn't really thought of the bazaar as being part of that. But I realized that after a while, that was because I was trying to be too solitary. You know, I was trying to do my walk and I couldn't see why I couldn't cross the street where I wanted to cross it and all this stuff. And I realized after a few weeks that, in fact, the only way I can walk there is to walk as part of the crowd and to actually find a crowd that is crossing the road, and just be part of them. And as soon as I did that, my life became much easier. And I think until I heard you talking about that actually as a kind of philosophy, the crowd walking, I haven't quite put all that together and made sense of it. So that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, except that I think where the crowd is, what place, that also, like, it's not the same how people walk in the bazaar. Like, I find it interesting that even though it's a really crowded place, there's not pushing and shoving, which happens in a lot of other places. For instance, in the Delhi metro, that's also a certain kind of movement with the crowd, but you literally get shoved into the train and shoved out. Here, there's this whole thing of being mindful, and that's something that you learn only after you've spent a lot of time in the bazaar. Yeah, like what I find interesting is how there's always this tiny bit of distance between different walkers, and what are the body techniques that people use to maintain that distance.
Is there a political dimension to crowd walking?
In the bazaar, I'm not sure whether there's a political dimension to the crowd, but the fact that the bazaar allows for so many women become part of the crowd, and Delhi is not a very women-friendly city. That for me would be political. Not sure if I've answered your question.
No, I mean, could you inspire a revolution by walking in a crowd, or get people thinking
Not,
about
no,
activity?
not in the bazaar. And I'm not sure. No, definitely. But the crowd in protest marches, how they walk, is very different from how people walk in the bazaar. That's why I was saying that it's.
Well, could you say how it's different? Could you put that into one?
In protest marches, at least here in Delhi, there are people. Walking, following each other. So it's almost like there are rows of people or there's a line of people. In the bazaar, even though you're trying to maintain a distance, people also zigzag a lot. Because you go to one shop, you see something else, or you see a person you know on the other side. So there's a continuous zigzag motion. It's not like people are walking in straight lines. Protesters here are much more, I mean, I wouldn't say it's like a march, but the rhythm would be more even in a protest march.
Yeah, but are there sort of ideas exchanged? It doesn't have to be revolution. Are there sort of ideas exchanged that are of the group rather than of the individual? Do you come away with new thoughts that you wouldn't have had you walked on your own? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Thank you, Bob. We'll come back to you later after we have done some exploration of the questions in the chat. Yes, Samprati, can you see the chat, or shall I?
Yes, I can.
Thanks.
Yeah, so about intergenerational practices, how people of different age groups walk in the bazaar? Is that the question?
Hi, Samprati. I was really thinking about the individual and the sociality, and I was very struck by you talking about folk. You know, you bump into folk and you bump into friends or acquaintances. And then I guess I was wondering whether people walk through the bazaar, you know, with their children or with their sisters or mothers, or
Yes.
just, you know, how much of a sort of familial route. They may also have, you know, practices that are passed down. You know, I guess sort of family habits, favourite sports. Just
There are as many solo walkers as people going out with families and friends. But then, like I said, even if it's a solo walker, you will, because a lot of these people repeat this as a ritual. So you know a lot of people in the bazaar. You also have a relationship of familiarity with the traders, and there's a lot of like with uh, the traders are primarily men, and there's a lot of sometimes there's a lot of flirting and banter between the traders and the women. You will invariably bump into someone or the other. It could be somebody you haven't seen for years, and a lot of people say the reason, like, what is the point of going to the bazaar unless you don't bump into someone you know? Younger people, I mean, unless like people, they're teens or younger, sometimes they're sent by parents to run some errands in the bazaar, which sometimes they don't like. But it is also sometimes the bazaar sometimes becomes a place for a secret meeting with your lover because it is so crowded. Um, yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes, that's very interesting, getting lost in the crowd in terms of, being discreet. Thank you for that. I know there are other questions, so I'll mute myself, Samprati.
So I'm taking up Christina's question, is how big are these bazaars and for how long do you spend time there? So there are different bazaars are of different sizes really. Some of the smaller bazaars would be just along, say, a 1 kilometer stretch of a pavement, and then there are others which are like really sprawling, and they would have as many as 1,000 shops, 1,000 stalls. Um, how long do I spend time there? Are you referring to my field work? During my work, I used to typically walk there for 4 hours, basically, or till I could not walk anymore. Um, yeah, these bazaars usually start sometime in the late afternoon and go on till about 10 in the night. But interestingly, how much time I spent in the bazaar also depended on how far the bazaar was. If it was a bazaar closer home, then I could stay there till the bazaar closed. Because otherwise, yes, I did speak about the rhythm, walking, stopping, and starting. What is the question?
I think we have a question of Tamsin. Would you like to ask the question yourself, Tamsin?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. Yes, I just had an image as you were talking of a sort of a dance of people zigzagging, as you say, meeting and separating, and it felt like there was this choreography, this change of rhythm, and you conjured up this lovely image, and I just wondered, but I was aware that I missed little bits in the middle when my Wi-Fi went out, so I just wondered if you had that sense sometimes of standing back and watching that choreography going on, and what that made you feel when you if that happened. Thank you.
Standing and watching back is possible only at um, certain times of the bazaar, when the bazaar is kind of just starting for, and that's not when the most exciting stuff happens. More exciting stuff happens when it's like in its full form. And at that point of time, the only place where you can stand is if you're standing at a shop. Like there's no place where you can actually stand for very prolonged times. Uh, the best way to actually spend more time in the bazaar is to be on the move. Um, stand in one place only when the bazaar is being set up, but then that's also very interesting how actually materials come together and shops are set up, and traders have their own rhythms of work and all of that. Um, if you're inside a stall, there are a lot of women also um, spend time in there are some shops where women spend a lot of time. particularly shops selling stuff for women. It could be cosmetics or jewelry, and they become places where um, women gossip and spend. But that's inside a stall, so you don't really have a view of people walking. So the best way to actually watch this whole thing, watch, or even because you're also doing it yourself, or after a certain point of time, you learn how to walk with the crowd. The only way to experience it is by doing it, and not be. You cannot be. It's impossible to be just an observer in the bazaar, which is what I was trying to do initially, which was quite idiotic. But you cannot be. You cannot be a passive observer, and you cannot. It's also impossible not to. Even if you say that I'm a solo walker, I'm not going to talk to anybody. There will be invariably somebody who's going to talk to you. So it's impossible not to have encounters.
And almost impossible for there to be stillness. Then there's just this constant. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Andrew, you had a question. Could you share it with us?
Yes, hello, Samprati. Thanks very much for your presentation. I'm sorry I'm hiding under my wife's name of Mel Sutton, so it's a bit confusing. It was just that when I was a student, I used to be employed as a professional queuer, someone who would appear to be queuing for a market stall, when in fact I wasn't queuing at all. But it was just to make a market stall appear more popular than another one. And I wondered whether there was any similar mischief going on in the bazaars where stall holders actually employ people to almost form a group and become a crowd or steer a crowd towards their stalls. Is there any kind of mischief like that?
Yeah, usually, I'm not sure whether you can call it mischief, but there's this tactic of there'll be one helper who will be usually standing on either on a table or and sort of like loudly calling people and saying things in this sing-song way, and trying to outshout a neighboring stall. Um, but in terms of traders actually like conjuring up a fake crowd, no, that doesn't work. That doesn't happen. These are very small traders, and most shops have either like one or people, and they're usually family members. And setting up a stall in the bazaar is a very labor-intensive process. So they actually carry their wares to the bazaar site. They set up the shop. They are talking to customers. They're managing bargaining. They are keeping an eye out that nobody's stealing. So it's so intensive, and they're usually not more than two people in a stall.
Yeah, I sort of posted a follow-up question, which is sort of kind of similar, but different, in as much that we do have temporary street markets in the UK, but we often have fixed markets, and you know, some quite well-known ones to people in Britain. That, you know, you sort of say, "Oh, I'm going to Commercial Road," and everyone kind of knows where you're going in London. But the majority of the street markets are linear, and so therefore the stallholder is selling their produce or their products to you, and you're facing them. The ones which are, I think, are more intriguing for the movement of people and offer themselves perhaps to greater artistic interpretation are those stalls in which, those markets that have stalls in which you can enter, and then you're within something, rather than making something across the stall. We did quite a lot of art projects. We called them art projects to try to win funding for them, to be honest. But they were based around exactly what you're talking about, trying to explore how people move as a crowd and how you can squeeze a crowd and how you can allow a crowd to expand, and how people envisage the spaces in which they're entering, whether they're narrow or broad. And we did that using existing markets and then just narrowing the passageways. And we also did it in trade shows where we narrowed the passageway between booths and places. Anyway, it's really fascinating. Thank you so much for contributing. It's just a comment, it's not really a question.
Should I quickly, though, respond to that? Most bazaars, actually, the shape of the bazaar takes the shape of the street. Sometimes if the street is linear, then the stalls are in rows, and that is also done to maximize space. There is no space between individual stalls. But the neighborhood that I was talking about, Nizamuddin Basti, it has lanes which are meandering lanes, and they're not, except, I mean, there's one part of the bazaar which is a square space, but otherwise the bazaar actually spills into the alleys of the neighborhood, and those are not linear alleys. And so you will actually not find the tables or the stalls. What a lot of traders do is they will use the facades of houses to hang things, or even walls. So in some ways, the shape of the bazaar molds itself to the architecture of the streets, and a lot of customers, in fact, talk about how it almost appears as if the bazaar is growing out of. Yeah, there's actually a lot of variation, and even in bazaars which actually have a linear shape, people don't necessarily walk along those linear paths because the shops are so densely packed, and sometimes there are 3 rows. There's something about that particular design which makes it possible for people to do this whole zigzagging, because you are at one stall, you'll see somebody shouting out something, or you smell some food. So there's a lot of back and forth. So even though the bazaar might be linear, the walking paths are hardly linear, and there's something about the density of those linear packed shops which allows for this zigzagging.
Yes, amazing. Clara, did you have your question ready?
Yeah, I was wondering if maybe it's different in big cities in India than in rural, but as I was wondering if the bazaar is not the exception in the normal in the habit of walking, because in India, as my experience, nobody walks. And I at the beginning of my living there, because I lived there for a long time and then I came back many times, but at the beginning, maybe it's only in the south, but everybody was amazing and very strange at me, because I used to ask for going to walk, and in fact the places were meant for cars and for other kind of vehicles, and the only place where you could walk more or less relaxed, not only because it was easier to walk, but also because you were not so much seen, was the bazaar. Because in the bazaar there are so many things to see that you are not remarked, especially if you are a stranger, a different person, and also I remember in sari you walk very bad because you cannot open your legs completely, and also it is very hot, even if it is a cotton sari. So I wonder if just the bazaar is not the exception, where you really can walk a little bit, comparatively with all these very crowded with vehicles streets which are not meant for walking. But I am not sure if it is the rule in everywhere in India, because I have been in Delhi only 1 week, and most of the time I have a fast.
Delhi is not a very friendly place to walk, at least if you look at it purely in terms of infrastructure, or in terms of safety and all that. But there are still a vast diversity of people who walk. The bazaar is a place where you see a lot of walkers, but you will also there are some people, and these are particularly middle class, upper middle class families who actually bring their cars to the bazaar, and they will often not even step out of the car, and a trader will come and give them fresh. And the middle class and the upper middle class goes to these bazaars only to buy fresh vegetables and fruits. And usually the vegetable section of the bazaar is set apart. It's at the entry of the bazaar. So people often get their cars. So there's that also. There are people who will do anything to avoid walking. But then there is another large category of people who walk for various reasons. I mean, one can say that probably like the women of Nizamuddin Basti walk in the bazaar because they have to make very complex calculations about going somewhere else. It may not be simply financially feasible. But then I don't want to reduce their relationship to the bazaar to just that. That might be the starting point, but over the repetition of their practices, there is a certain relationship with the bazaar.
Thank
you. Okay.
Great. Then we are coming back to Bob.
Yeah. I still think you're using it as a backdrop rather than because you're saying that the bazaar and all the people who are there, rather than the interaction of the crowd with the bazaar and what that might be producing. You refer to it, but you've never told us what the consequence of the crowd interacting with the guitar, with the bazaar, and then what new comes out of that. That's what I'm interested in, what it leads to, rather than having it, say, rather conservative as a thing that's static, having a thing that's potentially changing and that can be a sort of interactive activity.
Okay, I'm going to think about that, but I don't think the bazaar or walking in the bazaar has any radical possibility. But it can still be something valuable.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure it is. Yeah.
It doesn't change. Walking in the bazaar doesn't change the world. Though it's interesting how, like for me, it's interesting how women sort of push their choices and are asserting control over their time in the bazaar. What they do, they might be telling their families that we're going to shop for the family, but the time they spend in the bazaar and what they do in the bazaar is theirs.
So, for example, you referred to the zigzagging. Would they then, when they go home, take that zigzagging as a sort of a different way of talking to their to the people they know? I.e., they'll learn something from the experience and take it away, and something that would change in their own lives as a consequence. That's what I'm interested in. there's something you can take from it as a almost a magical thing, or as I said, I used it as a spiritual thing, which you didn't comment on. But I'm just wondering if there is that dimension.
That's something for me to think about.
That.
Thank you.
Now, Babak.
Babak, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Samprati. I also have a question, indeed. You are clearly walking in bazaars in Delhi, but maybe you're also walking in other places. If only that would, I think, be interesting, because in different places, bazaars might not always be on the street, right? If you think of more like Ottoman or Turkish style bazaar, they tend to be covered affairs, which more are like mazes themselves. So maybe you have some experience with that as well. But either way, my question is, have you seen different types of behaviors or aspects to how people behave or walk in different bazaars? And are you able, or have you been able to attach justifications or reasons for these different behaviors in these different places?
I mean, I've walked in other kinds of markets, permanent markets. What the bazaar allows for is both walking and not walking. In a lot of the permanent markets, the encounters between, say, the shopkeeper and the customer, it's more fleeting. You usually go to a market, you do what you have to do. They're not these elaborate walking itineraries. And what I was saying about how the bazaar is designed, that it allows for this is also this sensual excess because of the tightly packed shops and the crowd. It allows for a certain kind of walking. In the other kinds of neighborhood markets, which are permanent markets, it becomes about going and buying something. Or it could be about hanging out at a particular spot. You hang out at a tea shop, or you hang out in a cafe. So it in some ways, consumption becomes more important rather than a process of procuring things. In the bazaar, people will also often, if you have to buy something, you will go to 10 shops and check out. Right? In a permanent market, you kind of know, okay, there's no bargaining and all of that involved, which is so central to the experience of the bazaar, which also is related to walking.
There's no bargaining. Have you been to an Ottoman or a Turkish market? There is only bargaining.
No, I'm comparing these bazaars with kind of the permanent markets here in Delhi.
Yeah, right. Which also, I would think, would be maybe inside, right?
Which are fixed price shops, yeah.
Right, yeah. Yeah, true. I suppose that does influence the way that people move through these places. But yeah, okay.
In older parts of Delhi, which is the old city, there would be some experiences which are very similar to periodic markets that I'm talking about, to the weekly bazaars, except that there, the rhythms are very different. Here, people wait for a week for the bazaar to come back. So a lot of people are planning a lot of activities for that day of the week. This is why the crowd swells up. Even markets which are bazaar-like in older parts of the city have a different rhythm. People don't have the same intensity of, you will go there once in a month. Buy something.
Yeah, and this brings up another question, actually. Do you see differences in behavior between parts of Delhi that are more affluent and that are poorer?
Absolutely. And this is not just related to bazaars, it would be related to all kinds of public places.
Of course.
In fact, even in some affluent parts of Delhi, even public paths are actually not meant for everybody. So you increasingly public parks in the affluent colonies now will have security guards or surveillance cameras, and they do not, even though there is nothing official or legal about it, people who look poor are not allowed to use those parks. Um, and then there are
so you're saying neoliberalism has reached New Delhi as well?
Of course, absolutely.
Can we blame your prime minister for this?
This has been a long process, and with bazaars, there are some affluent localities which do not allow for these bazaars in their vicinity, and not even any kind of street, like I showed those images of the street vendors with a push cart. They are not allowed. Some parts of the city are not open to them, which then means that they have to often take a very long roundabout route. And then there are bazaars so it's not like a lot of the poor localities not out there somewhere. They also adjoin affluent localities or middle class localities. And some bazaars do have customers coming from across classes. Now, for instance, the Nizamuddin Basti bazaar, which primarily caters to the low-income residents of the neighborhood, now increasingly is attracting women from affluent localities close by because they find the best deals there. Except that, again, they have a very different relationship with the bazaar. They will usually reach the bazaar just as it begins, and they buy in bulk because, and then leave. And the women of the Basti really look down upon this shopping practice because it is just about consumption. It is about just getting a good deal, and doesn't necessarily translate to a relationship with the place. So yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of diversities across the city, and Delhi is so large and is made up of you can almost, the different worlds within the city. And there's only, even though I've lived here for 20 years and I've done this intensive field work and all of that, I only know a really tiny part of the city. It continues to like sprawl and spread and transform.
Thank you, Samprati. Thank you, Babak. I think it's slowly time to close our Walk, Listen, Bazaar for the day. And after this drift together with you, Samprati, it was amazingly interesting, and actually we should do it again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining us. Don't forget that we have every 2 weeks a cafe. So the next one is with Silvia Molina. She's a Spanish artist that lives in Sweden. She walks and drifts through Stockholm and stitches her paths in a notebook. So next cafe in 2 weeks, you can listen to Silvia. Once more, thank you so much, Samprati, for this very generous and very courageous night you spent with us. Good night, and to all of you, see you again. And thank you for being here.